Welcome back. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time, and today we're talking Lume. Specifically, the best watches I've ever seen when it comes to Lume. The Three Kings of Lume, if you will. A lot of you probably know the first one. Some of you may know the second. But the third one is brand new. In fact, I just got it a couple weeks ago. This is a story that starts almost 3 years ago, with a rather unusual watch known as the Phoibos Great Wall, which may surprise some of you newer viewers who aren't familiar with it, especially since Phoibos hasn't done anything quite as good since this one came out, at least when it comes to Lume. As usual, Phoibos sent this watch in for review, and as part of my normal reviewing procedures, I tested out the Lume, and it completely blew me away. At the time, it was easily the best Lume I'd ever seen. And 3 years later, it still is. Every time I get a watch that really shows some promise, I'll compare it to the Great Wall. And so far, nothing has beaten it. Now, before we get too far, I should probably give you some frame of reference. So when I say that this is the best Lume I'd ever seen, you know what I'm talking about. When I evaluate Lume for review, I use my Seiko Turtle as a reference for good. I figure most people have seen a Seiko diver at some point, so Seiko's a good starting point. Now, Seiko, or good Lume, is down here. Then you have Great Lume, Excellent Lume, and just above that, you have the Great Wall. When it comes to Great Lume, there are a number of watches I've seen. Probably too many to count. Seiko's good, but there's a lot of things out there that are better. Out of those, the most prominent of which is probably the Orient Komatsu. For Excellent Lume, there's only a handful, and for that I'd say look at something like an Orient Triton, or maybe a Citizen ProMaster, as well as most of the watches I've seen from the Swiss Watch Company. Although note that that does include the Gen 1 Swiss Watch Company diver, but I never got a production model from the Gen 2 to really test out. This also includes the Zelos Abyss, a 3,000 meter diver that is the epitome of overkill. All of those are excellent examples of Excellent Lume, and I've tested every single one against the Great Wall, and the Great Wall always seems to come out just on top. So what makes the Great Wall so great when it comes to Lume? Well, I think there are two things. The design, and at the time, Phoibos had a really strong desire to push into a higher price tier. For the design, Phoibos wanted something to really emulate the Great Wall. So you have these jumbo-sized weapons and shields as indices, which is odd and completely bizarre. But that design also translates into one that has a lot of surface area for Lume. And at the time, Phoibos was really trying to push into a higher price tier, and the Great Wall was kind of their experiment into that. The Great Wall was a lot more than their typical watches. It was also the first with a sapphire bezel, and it was the first with an ETA movement. So they're really trying to push into new territory. And along the same lines, they went overboard with the Lume, by putting down what was unheard of at the time, 15 layers of X1 grade superluminova. Now, as a side note, the Great Wall kind of backfired on Phoibos. At the time, they were really trying to push beyond being a budget homage company. But in retrospect, I think the Great Wall was just too much too soon. People weren't as familiar with the brand, and many didn't want to pay that much for a pretty unusual design, and especially one from a company they'd never heard of. After the Great Wall, they kind of went back to their basics, and only in the last year have they started trying to really push original designs, as well as try to push past that $400 price point. Regardless, it was the combination of that design, along with a desire to really push their capabilities, that created a recipe for a true Lume monster, which over the last 3 years has constantly come out on top, and that's why I started calling it the King of Lume. And for a while, it was the only one. About a year and a half after I saw the Great Wall, I finally ran into another watch that I thought could go toe-to-toe with it, and I was surprised to see that it was a watch from Orient, or rather, Orient Star. This is a watch that never really got a nickname. It's basically just known as the Orient Star Diver. If you've never seen this review, go check it out. It's definitely worth it. It's a watch I bought, love, and I'm never getting rid of. It's pretty much everything you could expect from Orient Star, plus maybe a little more. From just wearing it around, I knew it had good Lume. It's one of those watches that always have a faint green glow to them, no matter where you are. But while I knew it was going to be good, I wasn't expecting it to be this good. Which is why I wound up testing this thing 3 different times with different sets of watches. The first 2 times it kept doing better than I thought it would, so I kept having to up the ante. In the end, I ran a longer test directly against the Great Wall. and it basically ended in a tie, where the Great Wall had a little bit better lume on the hands, and the Orient Star had better indices. Now, the Great Wall will always be the High King. It was first and has so far never been beaten. But now with that Orient, I had a second king to keep it company. Flash forward another year and a half to a couple of weeks ago, and I actually wound up getting two different watches in that had really strong lume. So I wound up putting both of them up against the Great Wall. The first is actually a pretty surprising find, as it's a $200 tuna homage from Proxima off AliExpress. Although while the case is a straight tuna, the dial has their own spin on it. I should have a review of this one out pretty soon, but the short version is that it's pretty impressive for the price, and especially the lume. The second watch I got was the Adamascus 88 from Wise Watches out of Thailand. I'll probably have a review out on this one next month, but if you can't wait, go check out Dave's. But short version is that the watch is very impressive. It's actually made out of 904L steel and has this really beautiful, fascinating dial. With this particular colorway, the bezel unfortunately has light old radium lume. Some of the others don't, they're just straight BGW9. But more importantly is that the BGW9 on the dial with this one is strong. So since I had two pretty good contenders, I decided to do a longer three-way test. And as you can see, the Proxima is excellent, but it's not quite up to the same level as the Great Wall. However, the Wise is, and that watch goes toe-to-toe with it. In the end, I think I'm going to have to call this one another draw. Just like the Orient Star, the hands, and specifically the minute hand on the Wise, fades out just a little bit before the Great Walls. Yet, just like the Orient Star, its indices are better than the Great Walls. Although it is pretty close, and I think if that minute hand had lasted just a little bit longer, the Wise would have been a clear winner. So I might wind up testing this one more time before the final review. But either way, tying with the Great Wall is nothing to be ashamed of, because that still means this is one of the best watches I've ever seen and worthy of being a King of Lume. It's also worth noting that it did it with blue BGW9, which typically doesn't last as long as C3 or C1 green lume. So that's just another reason to be impressed with it. Now, I'm always on the hunt for more, but so far it seems like I only run into one of these about every year and a half. So we'll see when the next one pops up. But if you have any suggestions for good watches with lume that I should check out that you think could be a contender for a King of Lume, let me know down below. As well as what do you think about these in the history of relative time. But as always, if you enjoyed the video, you all know what to do down below. I'm Shane, this is Relative Time. See you next time.